Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more history matters, and this time, how did the Great Depression affect the rest of the world? A short animated documentary. Now, before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you joined the Discord and followed me over at Twitch. Now, this is only 3 minutes, so I'm assuming that we're probably only going to be talking about a couple countries here, and certainly not the rest of the world. But now, at least from an American's perspective, we literally do not really hear how the Great Depression affected the rest of the world. We are simply told, yeah, the rest of the world fell into a depression too. And then that's literally all that's said. Well, it kind of gets how the depression affected the rest of the world. We kind of learn a little bit about it in regards to Germany, if a class that ends up covering World War II. Typically, they don't cover World War II. They actually just cover uh, um, the rise of Nazism and Hitler, and how that ties into the Great Depression. And then we just kind of like World War II. You already know about it, and then it's over. And then we talk about post-war. That's usually how it goes. So aside from how it affected Germany and the USA, I don't know. I don't really know. So let's go ahead and learn.
The Great Depression sucked for a lot of people. When it's discussed,
That's one way to put it.
it's often only in reference to the United States or Germany.
I said that.
And the impact that it had on their societies. But what about the other major powers in the world? How much, if at all, did the Great Depression affect them, and how did their leaders try to deal with it? So, as you'll probably know, the Great Depression began in the late 1920s. This led to businesses collapsing.
Actually, specifically 1928. Was it October 28 or October 29? Fuck. I can't remember.
People losing their jobs, those people then had less money to spend, meaning other businesses couldn't sell stuff, meaning theirs went bust, and so forth. This led to
See, this is why I don't understand how capitalism has ended up the way it has. Because it's like, literally, the very basic principle of it is people have money, people will spend money. So why the fuck are these businesses not providing, their employees with one, a livable wage, and two, more than a livable wage? Because here's the thing, they have the money to afford it, okay? And two, literally, Mr. Ford himself, Henry Ford, literally he paid his employees so well because he was like, if I pay them good enough, they're also going to then come back to me and spend their money on our own business. They're going to be, one, happy, so they're going to be more productive. Two, they will then spend their money on the wider economy, which then only boosts my own business, because if other businesses are succeeding, that means their employees are also succeeding better in life, which means then those employees also have excess wealth, which means those employees can then go and spend it on my vehicle that I am producing at a cheap, cost-affordable cost. I don't understand how we've ended up at this point. How we've ended up is it doesn't make sense. Why? It would be in the interest of the capitalists to pay us a livable wage, but they're not. They're literally shooting themselves in the fucking foot. They're making people hate them. This turned into an economic rant. Sorry, hold on, back to
a downward spiral that saw international trade collapse. So how did it affect the great powers? Polar opposite to the United States was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, one of the two communist countries in the world at this point. And given that they were under international sanction and barred from most cross-border trade, the Great Depression had very little effect on it. In fact, being able to point to declining capitalist economies was a massive propaganda boon, especially when combined with the 100,000 US citizens that went to the Soviet Union for a better life. Just in time for the coming purges. The lack of opportunities in the rest of the world saw many technical experts head to the USSR to help help set up factories, which meant that as a result, the USSR saw substantial economic growth whilst the rest of the world declined, an effect which helped to bolster support for communism across numerous countries. In Britain, the Great Depression was different to the United States in that the British government had cleverly prepared for it. You see, it's impossible to enter an economic depression if you never left one, which was the case for the UK, which had been in a prolonged economic downturn since the end of the First World War. The British government panicked and sought to balance its budget because it was running out of gold reserves. As such, Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald sought to raise taxes and cut spending, which his party, the Labour Party, couldn't countenance. As such, he quit the Labour Party and then formed a new Labour Party and governed with the Conservatives. Britain would recover from the Depression by 1935, because the only way was up at that point. This was mostly due to it leaving the gold standard and thus being able to devalue the pound to boost exports. And unemployment went down fairly quickly after Britain began a programme of mass rearmament, just in case that new German government got up to something. France avoided the worst of the crisis because it was much more self-sufficient in things like agriculture and manufacturing. There was a mild effect on employment.
René and Pierre both lose jobs. Okay, here we go. Le French génial. Oh, do I try and speak in a French accent? Devastation for the French economy as both Pierre and René have been made unemployed. This, of course, can't do it. This, of course, means I can't keep it going. This, of course, means France will see a sharp rise in its unemployment rate, with the total number of jobless bums going up from 6 to 8. Pierre, a former construction worker, was told that economic conditions made his position at the firm untenable. The 40 smoke breaks a day probably didn't help, to be fair, wheezed Pierre, whose wife is now looking for someone with better prospects. René had hoped that his job as a waiter would be saved thanks to the accent mark above his name, which he thought made him sound fancy. Alas, no. People don't have the money to spend on endless pastries and butter-cooked goods. The government has said it will do everything it can to relieve the pressures on the economy, so long as it isn't difficult and doesn't interrupt Prime Minister Laval's brunch. India names new capital. India has begun the use of its new capital city, New Delhi. The move was, in a shocking twist, instigated by the British, who felt the Indians would agree and thus felt no need to ask them. The primary motive for the move was that Calcutta was filled with too many nationalists who held radical ideals like support for self-determination. Now we know what you're thinking. Isn't there already a Delhi? There is, but due to it being filled with mosques and foreign-looking buildings, the British opted to build a new one using locally procured funds. This way they could work from somewhere that looks like London. When asked for comment, Gandhi said if they wanted London, then they could have, stayed there. Charges against him are currently being filed. President confident decade will end better. President Dumergue has given a speech to reassure the country that whilst things now aren't great, it is guaranteed that the decade will end in a much more prosperous place. Given the eternal and never-ending peace in Europe and the fact that we can still make Germany pay through the nostrils for losing, the economic prospect of France is looking up. Foreign ministers from across the continent have agreed with the assessment, citing that unless something crazy happened, like Hindenburg retiring or Mussolini abandoning his love of peace, that only prosperity can follow. The British refused to comment because they couldn't understand a reporter's accent, so shoot him off with a broom and told him to go back to Denmark. Yeah.
But France's decline was mild compared to Italy's, America's, or Germany's. It did, however, take a long time for France to recover from this decline relative to other nations because it fiercely held on to the gold standard. Many in France hated the idea of devaluing the franc, and so it wasn't until 1936 that they actually came off the gold standard and devalued their currency to boost exports. Italy was similar in that it also fiercely stuck to the gold standard, but the government there also saw the Great Depression as an opportunity. When important businesses collapsed, the government stepped in, and given that it ran a surplus, it was able to use excess money to continue paying wages and producing goods. Italy's economy was the second in Europe to recover after Britain's, and the crisis gave Italy's government near complete control over its economy, which it would soon turn to war. Outside of Europe, Japan was the first major economy to recover from the Great Depression. This was because its government opted to immediately devalue its currency and spend a bunch of it on keeping businesses open. This led to Japan's economy growing quite rapidly, whilst the European powers were still stagnant, meaning that the Japanese economy was much better prepared for foreign adventures. The major powers had mostly recovered by the beginning of the Second World War, but it wasn't until the mid-1950s that all of them had beaten their pre-depression metrics. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Man, I wonder what happened in the 40s that slowed them down. I wonder. But that was how the Great Depression affected the rest of the world, a short animated documentary by History Matters. And they did a really good job covering all that in 3 minutes. I thought that was fantastic. I don't really think, in regards to like how long they're doing this, like the length of this video, how much they were able to cover in 3 minutes, like with the context, very impressive, I feel like. So this was another fantastic episode. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.